I'm super happy to introduce Juan Capistra, who's a Los Angeles-based multidisciplinary artist whose work commonly questions notions of identity, power, class, and revolution. He received his BFA at Otis, his MFA from UC Irvine in 2002. Um, Recently had to show up at various small fires in LA. Recently had some work shown in Mexico and Berlin. Has shown at LACMA and the New Museum, the MCA in Detroit. Was part of Made in LA 2014, I believe, at the Hammer Museum. Um, I think that should be cool enough, and let's get it started.
um, Thanks, Freddie, and thank all you all for having me here today. Happy to be here. Happy to share what I've been doing for some time now. But I'm going to show work from maybe the past 5-6 years, various projects that are either photo-based, installation, sculptural. If you guys have questions, feel free, put them in the chat, or we'll wait till the end. But I'm going to start off with this series from, I think it was 2013, is this series titled White Riot, Be the Beacon, Be the Light, KO'd by Love. And it's a body of work composed primarily of photographs. And they are all these white objects shot on a white background. The whole show is very minimal, very somber, and it had to do with this idea of death and rebirth, not just on a physical, but in a spiritual and ideological sense. I had come to a point in, as not in my career as an artist, but just as an artist in general, had come to a point where I was really questioning what my role as an artist was. Was there a point to making art? What was I making? What the audience, who was the audience? And so this work was a lot about this kind of, in a way, reclaiming or kind of trying to embed new meaning into these reference points or these ideas that I referenced in my work a lot. So the objects in the show, which some of these images are probably going to be hard to see. The photographs were objects that related to ideas of revolution or resistance, or like this is a bottle or Molotov cocktail. Again, it's really subtle. It's really hard to see. A brick, which to me has actually carried over a lot in my work, and the brick has appeared a lot in continuously in different forms. And I reference this brick, or the idea of what a brick can do on many levels. It could be used to build, to create, as a basic fundamental object to make something, but at the same time, it could be used, really easily to destroy, to shatter, to break. And it's something that comes from, my own personal experience here in LA. And so again, this work was about that, was this kind of taking these ideas of resistance and kind of my entry point to these ideas have always been the 60s, the civil rights movement, um, because when I grew up and where I grew up, a lot of my teachers growing up in elementary, middle school, and high school were active in the civil rights movement. So at an early age, I was indoctrinated into these ideas, these struggles, these fights for social justice, specifically here in the United States. So for me, like, I grew up with these ideas of the power, we, me, we, this idea of power to the people. But I had gotten to this point in terms of, the art world and um, the world of art, and how, these ideas that one has in their personal life kind of might clash or weren't gelling as well in this kind of professional world. So at one point, I felt like giving in and giving up and stopping making work. It had gotten to that point where I was just fed up with the business side, I guess. So yeah, so this work was again like kind of in a very romanticized way. It was me falling in love again with these ideas that made me want to be an artist, made me believe in the power of art, made me believe in the beauty and strength that art can share and give someone. And the central piece in the installation was this black flag that was bleached white, and then again is and me re-dyeing it again black, with the black flag symbolizing again this idea of anarchy and revolution and resistance. And kind of like the black flag is installed in this very traditional military memorial way where it's folded. And sorry, my cat just joined the conversation. And then it's folded in a way where it's kind of unraveling. It's not completely tucked in. And what's unraveling is the black that's becoming, or the black that's being reintroduced to the bleached out fabric. And on the corner, there's a little pin that has the text, "Till the razor cuts," which again is this idea of like rebirth and death. Are these images coming? Are they pretty clear to you guys? And all the works also alluded, in terms of the titles, they reference Nathaniel Hawthorne, and this poem that specifically talked about like an individual's life in terms of like birth, kind of middle age, and the twilight years. So each photograph is titled after a specific passage from this poem, and it talks about like the kind of the sorrow and guilt and sadness associated with this kind of arcing trajectory that one has. And I like to kind of start this conversation with this body of work, because I feel like when I reached this point, I think the way I made the things that I made and the conversations that followed after were very specific and kind of rooted in this kind of reimagining, or this idea of, I think another reference to the work is this idea of tabula rasa, this idea of like erasure and kind of cleaning the slate and kind of beginning anew. So the projects that followed after this, again, kind of are rooted in these ideas and reference this work. So we'll move forward. This is another sculpture, again, how I mentioned previously, how the brick, this idea of the brick kind of carries over through a lot of projects, and it becomes like this kind of very specific object that I keep referencing back. And this was a small scale sculpture of again a white brick holding a black flag, and it's kind of in this, the way that it's situated, the way that it's placed, it's kind of the viewer is not sure in terms of like what is this brick doing. Like, to me, the brick embodies myself. A lot of the work that I do, like the objects, are kind of stand-ins for my body, for myself. So I see myself in this as like this brick kind of planting this black flag, again, kind of claiming this space, or kind of, trying to reclaim this space. And again, this body of work was also shown with this other video, this performative video documentation of me taking these white painted bricks and then smashing them together until they're completely gone. They're completely dissolved, and all that's left is like this red residue. So there's like this subtle kind of play with like the red brick dust residue kind of reads as blood, and it's this, this kind of the video, the performance is this kind of inner dialogue that I constantly have with myself in terms of like the meaning and intent, the purpose of, or the role of an artist. This kind of classic me against the world, kind of, again, playing with these very like kind of romanticized notions of what it means to be an artist and the role of an artist, and what one can do, when one can convey when producing work. And so, the performance starts off very simple, very easily, and it's just the bricks kind of like this kind of going back and forth until they shatter, and then the video just loops again. And then again, going back to these kind of, I think with my practice, I think I've developed a kind of visual language where I like to go back and reference specific objects, specific things, and these objects, again, like I said earlier, become stand-ins for myself. Where this piece, it's like my physical body became the stand-in for a black flag. And this was a vinyl piece that was installed at the Hammer Museum to scale. So that's like the actual, like to scale of my body. Where again, when I made this piece originally, it was in 2014, I think it was 24 or 2013. And it was right after, again, you know, like a police shooting. Trayvon Martin was killed. And I thought it was really interesting that one of the main things that they kept talking about in the media and the reports were that, you know, this young man was wearing a black hoodie, and that a black hoodie symbolized, you know, what a black hoodie symbolized. I thought it was really interesting, the power of that, and how, you know, meaning is conveyed, and how meaning shifts and changes, and how, you know, to somebody a black hoodie is just a black hoodie, is just an article of clothing. To somebody a black hoodie symbolizes that this individual is a criminal, this individual is up to no good. So I thought it was, you know, again, and at the same time, this, you know, which it's kind of interesting that now the past year, couple of years, like these ideas have, you know, taken center stage. But for me, like growing up and being part of subcultures and being part of like anti-fascist groups, like this was like normal, where normal ideas that I've again grown up with. So like this piece specifically had to do with this idea of like, how does one embody like the resistance? How does one embody the struggle or the fight against injustice? So, you know, how does one really, you know, do you really believe and live these ideas? So, you know, this for me was like this kind of symbolic gesture of like, again, like the previous work, this idea of like giving in and reimagining, introducing new meaning to these old forms, these old ideas that I had already like believed in, but was kind of losing faith in. So again, like this idea of like, you know, this struggle is real, this fight is real, you know, this is like, this is something that I truly believe in. And how, you know, how do I promote that? How do I, you know, talk about this? So it is this, you know, I become the black flag, I become the symbol of resistance, I become the symbol of anarchy, the symbol of criminality, you know, what have you. And then we move on to this other work where I've collaborated on a lot of pieces and works with my wife, Hazel Mandujano, who's an artist and designer also. And for a lot of the projects that I do, there tends to be some kind of takeaway, some kind of object that the viewer can leave the exhibition with. And one of the pieces that we collaborated on was this this object, this takeaway that was for an exhibition that had to do with, it was all these works referencing the Black Panthers. And again, like my kind of personal connection with former members and how they've influenced my practice. In this show specifically, kind of getting ahead, but this show also included this text piece that was made out of the painted white bricks from the previous performance. So there were all these painted white bricks that were all smashed to create this text, you know, which is, it says, "I'm hoping to see the day." which the text itself is actually a reference or a lyric from early 90s house anthem, which to me, music plays a lot, has a big role in my practice. The music in terms of the subcultures that revolve around certain kinds of music, and to me, like electronic music, house music, techno music that originates in the early 80s and into the 90s comes from a really interesting place like Detroit and Chicago. And I think, I'm kind of going off topic, but so yeah, the text is specific to this house lyric, this house song that again envisions or hopes for a better day than where we are right now. And if you take into context the origins of house music, Chicago, Detroit, these areas that were kind of the epicenter of American industrialization, the kind of the birth of the middle class, and then you see what happens over time, and people leave the urban spaces, and then there's like this amazing futuristic music being created primarily by African Americans, and it's this music that just kind of transcends and sends you into this other space. So again, there's like that point of entry to this work. There's going back to like the takeaway that responded to that sculpture itself was this printout, this poster that we made, that on one side had the texture of the brick, and then on the other side had this kind of step by step of taking this same poster and crumbling it up to create like this rock, this paper rock that referenced the same like material that is used to create the sculpture, the text piece. And to me, it was this idea of like, what kind of, how do you transmit your ideas? How do you get your ideas out to the world? Like, um, is it this like kind of overt action, or is it this very kind of subtle, clandestine way where like this powerful idea can be like sent out into the world using like just like a simple sheet of paper that then becomes like this rock or object that you know metaphorically could be really destructive. Like this idea of like this paper rock was really interesting, and how like it mimics this powerful object, but at the same time it's this very kind of uh, flimsy thing. um, and this image of like the actual takeaway is shot in front of what used to be the Black Panthers headquarters in South Central LA. But the building is now gone. It was burned, and now on one side they built this new, kind of office building, and then there's this empty lot behind it, which kind of alludes to work that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. This idea of kind of these histories that I grew up with and was a part of, um, influence a big part of what I do, like these multiple um, lives, histories, trajectories that you know that I've experienced or have experienced from people telling me these stories, or just being part of Los Angeles. How's everybody doing? um, and then again, this is another shot of the video, the performance, the installation, and I also did again, keeping with this idea of like or these ideas of protest, resistance, these using this language, these iconographic images. I made these sculptures of these glass protest signs. So, you know, like this idea of what does it mean to like physically go out in the street and hold the sign and yell and shout and scream. You know, what is that doing? What does that mean? You know, what does it mean to have this, you know, this object transformed into like this glass object that's very fragile, but at the same time can be, you know, weaponized. So there's like, I was playing with like all these different ideas of what it means to like speak your mind, to be vocal in a public setting. And then the text that is etched, like all these signs had text and images etched on them. And the text and or images are all specifically again to me, to my body. They're all tattoos that I have on my body. And you know, all these tattoos again reference or are about this idea of resistance, or this idea of revolution. You know, there's text taken from May 68, like graffiti that was left over from the student protest in Paris. There's again the same text that was used in the previous piece, Till the Razor Cuts. There's like, you know, different again, kind of again echoing this idea of what does it mean to vocalize these ideas of resistance, and what does it mean to be an artist and talking about these ideas, you know. You know, is it too didactic? Is it, you know, is it too heavy-handed? Is it, you know, does this verge on propaganda? So all these ideas were, you know, are interesting to me, and you know, they revolve around all those. And now move on to another project. And this one is from 2015, and Freddie mentioned earlier, I actually got like restaged this sculpture again just recently, earlier this year. But this work originally was shown in 2015. And again, kind of the genesis of this project again starts with violence and police shootings in America. You know, the project, it's called Dogs of the World Unite, which is a reference to George Clinton, and then also a reference to like Diogenes, Greek philosopher, who was very, his ideas early on were very transgressive and were really challenging in terms of like social norms and what it meant to be an individual, what it meant to exist in society, and what one's role in that society was. You know, was it to be somebody that just kind of went along for the ride, or was it somebody that stood up and questioned the kind of social structure, or the kind of place that one is put in. Um, so the installation consisted of this dog kennel enclosure, where the viewer could go into. The viewer had to like crawl in, again, kind of mimicking a dog or an animal. The viewer could go into this space and put their head through this other part of the sculpture, which was a leather collar, and the viewer then is kind of collared to the sculpture itself. The viewer is chained to the kennel, to the enclosure, to the jail. So a lot of it had to do with like the viewer kind of giving, again, this playing with this idea of like letting go and giving in, and kind of believing in something. This idea, to me, it was like really interesting for me, like to play with this idea of kind of the same way that Diogenes was talking about. He's famous for saying, that the dog embodied the truest form of freedom. That a dog pretty much dictated its own destiny. It went wherever it wanted. It slept wherever it wanted. It fed, it ate whatever it wanted. So this idea of embodying a dog, you know, carries over through all the pieces in this series of work. And so I thought it was interesting to kind of have the viewer do that for like even just a split second, to experience the piece. Have the viewer crawl in to enter the sculpture and to activate the space. This is another piece, again referencing or using the signage that we know of, taking like a beware of dog sign and just changing the language, playing with subtle shifts, and creating this other meaning, which again, going with these ideas of Diogenes, this idea of questioning and again, being aware or being present or being a part of something. There's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. This was another sculpture that it's again the chains, and it's on one end, it's attached to this candle that's lit. The other end is a dog collar, and on the collar, it's stamped with the word sophos, which is translates to like a wise individual. And again, Diogenes was known for this idea of like searching and looking for this kind of higher level of being, or like this kind of getting to the point where you are hyper aware of your surroundings and the things that affect you. I think it's always, I draw parallels to Diogenes to Morpheus from I don't from the Matrix, from the film. So it's like these kind of characters, again, like this idea of like playing with like, what pill are you taking, or like what side are you choosing to see. And so, once you're in the sculpture and your head is looking out to your surroundings, then you see these series of photographs where, again, they're photographs of myself, with my hands up, again, very specific reference point to you know, this movement and what was going on at the time, and this idea of like fighting back and again, you know, really questioning what is going on in our culture. And there's like a couple reference points in the photographs where there's the obvious reference to hands up and BLM movement. There's also like this reference to like this art historical reference to Bruce Nauman and the fountain piece, this idea of like the role, again, the idea of the artist and what is his place in society, what is the artist doing, what are the responsibilities of an artist. Like it's like this kind of double play where like I'm recreating a recreation of a recreation, and Nauman where he recreates like traditional, like you know, Renaissance fountain, you can say. So like there's like, again, like this kind of referencing back and back. And then there's another reference like specific to like subcultural reference in what like I'm wearing on, and again like the spitting gesture, like in you know, subcultures like punk cultures, like this idea of like spitting on, you know, like a band that you're seeing. Like what does that mean? Like on one hand, like spitting on something is like this loving gesture. It could be taken as his loving appreciation gesture. And then on the other hand, to spit on something is to like bring it down, to like say it is less than you. So there's like this, I think that there's this interesting thing that happens with the viewer, artist, the institution, like all these power relationships come into play with this sculpture. Um, and then, you know, and it's myself. So like I implicate myself in this dynamic also, because there's no way of you not being, or myself not being a part of this structure, this system. And this is just a close-up of the photographs. And around the same time, 2015, 24, again, like I mentioned earlier, my wife Hazel and I collaborated on a lot of projects. We collaborated on this project space that we had for 3 years. We ran this space and hosted artists, designers, performances. The project space itself was like this tiny office room, and the space was called Mandujano Cell. And it operated in 3 kind of ways. It was the project space, a design studio, and also a store where we carried like one of a kind or small additions made by artists, designers. We worked directly with the artists or designers. We didn't work with any kind of other kind of in-between person. We wanted to have like this kind of really direct connection with the producers or the people, artists, artisans, what have you. And you know, we invited artists locally, nationally, and internationally. We also organized shows outside of the space at different galleries in LA and also out internationally. But this was a window piece, a text piece that I did for like, I think it was like the 3rd exhibition that we hosted. And again, it's this idea of one of the reasons why we opened the space here is I was really interested in this idea of how anybody that was walking by or driving by could potentially see the exhibition. They didn't need to go into like a gallery space. you know, you're sitting there at a red light, or you're sitting across the street at the juice bar that was across the street, and you had you know, the exhibition pretty much at your disposal. Um, so I was really interested in how artists kind of played around with this idea that their work was going to be constantly visible or on display. And actually, funny story: the first artist that we hosted, he built a wall right in front of the windows, so like the viewer was forced to come into the space. But after that, I think everybody else pretty much was open to this idea of having the work visible all the time. And you know, again, like um, language and text is a big part of my practice, and this idea of how to um, create meaning, and how to shift meaning, and how to introduce ideas out into the world. Um, I think it's kind of interesting now reading this text again, and how it takes on a different meaning now. um, you know, I think that's one of the interesting things about work. And you know, you make work and you show it in one context, and then you place it in another context, and sometimes it reads the same, sometimes it the meaning carries over, and then there's times where it like completely shifts and it becomes about something completely different. And this was again another example of like the takeaways that the viewer could take um, after, you know, seeing an exhibition. And now we go to this other show, or this other body of work from, I think this was 2016, 2017, or maybe even 2018. I forget the year, sorry. And this, again, this body of work kind of conflated these ideas from, there's a lot of reference points to the Black Panthers and the artwork of Emory Douglas, and ideas in the novel Lord of the Flies. So the show, like this is kind of like a install shot. I did a series of works on canvas where I recreated Emory Douglas's artwork that was found in the Black Panther newspaper. And a lot of them were like illustrations about, you know, from the civil rights movement. They're all recreated out of blood, sweat, and tears on canvas. This one piece specifically, in one of the magazines, there was this. I just thought it was like a really interesting design element in the magazine, was just this kind of like orange field printed in the newspaper. So this is just like this large kind of color field um, painting made out of blood, sweat, and tears. This is a ACAB made out of lard. Um, and lard, you know, like all the images that I recreate reference or have like the pig symbolizing the power structure of the police state, which was something that the Emory Douglas used a lot in his illustrations and artwork. So again, like, you know, I used the lard to spell out ACAB, which over time, the duration of the exhibition, the lard, the oils bled out. So the whole wall was saturated in lard. And again, I thought that again, really interesting, again, kind of going back to this, what I was saying earlier about this idea of how ideas are transmitted, how things disseminate out into the world. I thought it was interesting how, you know, taking this material in how, like, there's a lot of kind of like puns, or the lard bleeds out, right, and creates this other work. So the piece went from just being a literal ACAB on the wall to this kind of gooey mess. The gallery was not too happy afterwards. They had to tear out all that drywall and replace it, which I thought was really interesting. I thought it was pretty cool. This center sculpture is like, I think it's the main kind of what ties it to, again, the references to Lord of the Flies, where I created this kind of island in the middle of the gallery that is closed off by this section of wall, and the wall is made, it's like a miniature scale version of the border wall that separates the US and Mexico. And buried in the soil on the inside is a monitor with that had this video footage of burning text, burning passages. Some of it was from the novel from Lord of the Flies. Some of it was burning images, burning newspapers, the Black Panther newspapers. So is this kind of back and forth again, this kind of like destruction, creation. These again are the images, and some of the images, like, I edited, I changed from the original source material. But again, it's like these very kind of, again, images that challenge or question. And then the other layer in this work, like all the pieces were titled, again, after like graffiti slogans from Paris, from May 68. So again, like re-emphasizing again this idea of revolt, riot, resistance. So like the title of this piece is "We will ask nothing, we will demand nothing, we will take, occupy." So again, I think for me, it's always this kind of, how do I tie in these histories, like the Black Panthers, which were a social movement from like the 60s, to movements that are contemporary to me. This idea of like, even going back a few years ago to like Occupy, to BLM, to like, contemporary issues that, are still about now. So then we move forward to this text piece. I participated in the front triennial in Cleveland, Ohio, and I did a short residency there. And again, like I mentioned earlier, music and subcultures that revolve around music are a big influence in my practice. So this text piece came about from two bands that originate out of Cleveland, Zap, and which was late 70s, early 80s funk group that their music was sampled. It's like one of the biggest influence on West Coast rap. So like Zap and Roger, their music has been sampled over and over and over. So I thought it was interesting that they originate out of Cleveland. And then the other band was Per Ubu, which, it's an American post-punk band, which used their lyrics are very interesting, to say the least. And they're very I think one of the things about Peru is that they create these kind of spaces, literary spaces, that I found really interesting. So this text piece came about kind of combining these two source materials, their lyrics and their ideas. Like Perubu, like the band name originates from Ubu Roy, which is a play that was only when it originally premiered. It only it was only staged once, and it was so outlandish it created riots, and they never staged it again originally. But the character in Ubu Roy is this very like crass king who's very obnoxious, very the people hate him because he's just divisive. And I thought the character, again, parallels to today, was very much like, you know, our current president. So I did this text piece that existed in three iterations. There's the text piece in the facade of the residency hall, which reads, "So rough, so tough out here." Again, kind of talking about the social situation that we find ourselves in. This idea of you know, what the fuck is going on. And then there was a series of prints that were done in blood, sweat, and tears again. And then the third iteration of these prints, they were supposed to be installed all across the city, but there was a miscommunication with with the institution, and so the third component of this work was never actually installed. So the only way you could see these were at a gallery space. You could see these installed, but these were also meant to be installed out in the public, because part of the triennial was this idea of bringing people to the city, bringing people to experience the city. And the artists had installations all across the city. So I thought it would be interesting to have like this conversation with the viewers, with the audience, as they navigated the city from one institution or one installation to the next. You know, you would be walking down the street and come across a sign, you know, pinned, posted on a pole or something. But unfortunately, this was never realized. And now we get to like more recent work, where I'm from LA. I grew up here. I was born in Mexico, but my family immigrated to the States when I was 2. So really, I've grown up, and all I've really known is here, you know. And you know, growing up in South Central LA, kind of at the time, you know, in the early 80s, was at the height of the crack epidemic in Southern California and the gang epidemic. So it's a very tumultuous, very intense time in LA history, and, you know, across the board in US history. And, you know, so you have all this violence. You have, you know, the collapse of Southern California industry. Like, we used to have huge auto manufacturing plants and tire plants. You know, in the 70s, everything collapsed. The city is kind of turned around in terms of jobs. There's a huge influx that comes from Central America, from the US involvement in covert operations over there, that causes a huge crisis where people are fleeing to get away from the wars. And so, you know, people move to South Central because it's the most economical place. And you start having, clash of ideas, just a lot of things happen. And 91, there's an uptick in violence, police brutality, cops don't give a fuck. They're shooting everybody, beating everybody up. And then finally, we have the Rodney King beating where, anybody that grows up in these kind of environments, they didn't need the video to know that this was a common occurrence. But for the first time, I think people outside of these communities finally were witnessed the kind of life or what one is subjugated to in these situations. So we have the video, the cops go on trial, and everybody thinks it's, it's slam dunk. These cops are going to go to jail, they get off. We have the 92 riots that last for 5 days. I grew up back here in this kind of like little part back here. So to be a part and witness this event where the city burned for 5 days and everything around you was kind of leveled and destroyed, it kind of, for me, was the catalyst to where I am now. To me, it just solidified these ideas that had already been kind of introduced to me at my young age, with this idea of like this kind of search or quest or fight or struggle for social justice, or this idea to live a just life, which I think, that's what everybody wants, is to live a life where, you know, you don't, you're not, constantly living in fear. So this is 1992. I want to be an artist. I had the privilege of going to a private art institution where I am indoctrinated into the Western canon of art. And, before going to art school, my connection to art, aside from like field trips from school to museums, my introduction to like being creative was graffiti. And so I go to art school, I have like a graffiti background. I'm being told that this is the language, these are the codes, these are the signifiers, this is the aesthetic that I am supposed to use, or that this is the language that we use to talk about contemporary art. And all I wanted to do was, get out of the white cube. So in the late 90s, when I was in undergrad, I was doing these kind of works outside in the public space, and they reference like graffiti, the way that these pieces were installed, referenced the signage that was installed. All these sites were left over from the riots. So so these chain link fences went up around these empty lots where once there were these buildings, these businesses, and now people from the community would advertise their businesses on these chain link fences and put up signs for their businesses. And, I was making work, like this. It's a text piece. It's like one of my first text pieces where it reads Sublime. And I saw these spaces as like sublime spaces. They were like, like if you, the context, how these spaces were created, they were like these like horrific but beautiful spaces at the same time. So this is, like I started doing these in like 97, 98. And then, like 25 years later, I go back to these spaces to revisit these sites. And sadly, like, 2 decades later, there are still these sites in South Central. Like the landscape is still peppered with these empty lots that were never rebuilt. They've just become like these ruins in a way. they're like these kind of scars that pepper the landscape in predominantly South Central LA. So I went back into these spaces and created these ephemeral installations again, where I made these large scale bricks again, and I went to various sites and installed these bricks in this kind of, again, this kind of referencing back to the video work earlier, where it's like these two bricks kind of colliding. But it's kind of this like, are they colliding? Are they fighting? Or are they propping themselves up? Are they helping each other to stay up? So these installations remained in these different sites. And they just exist as documentation. Some of these bricks remained up for like just a couple of days, couple hours. I think the longest one was up for like a week. And this is an ongoing project where like the next series will be like these kind of like huge monumental sculptures created out of me throwing these large scale bricks into the empty lots. So I was like really interested in kind of this kind of tracing that happens, where you look at the trajectory of like what happens when you throw this brick. And again, it's playing with the idea of how earlier I was talking about the symbolism, or like the behind the brick, how it's this object that can create, and build something, but at the same time can destroy and be like this transgressive object. And I think it's also with this work specifically, how it's very performative, and how the object itself is destroyed at the end, because once I throw it, it just completely shatters.
Been an absolute pleasure.
Thank
You
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye.